Welcome back to Jerusalem Minute here on JNS TV. My name is Josh Haston, correspondent for JNS News, here with Alex Trayman, the CEO of JNS. And this morning at about 6:20 a.m., I got a rude awakening as my phone started going crazy, beeping uncontrollably, as the Houthis in Yemen once again launched a ballistic missile at central Israel this morning. I heard about 10 to 15 booms. Those are the Israeli interceptors taking down that rocket. Apparently, it happened outside of Israeli territory. But once again, Israel under attack. We have a ceasefire, which we're going to talk about later with Hezbollah. In the meantime, the war continues, and the Houthis, the Iranian-backed Houthis, continue to attack the state of Israel.
Yeah, the Houthis have been one of maybe the third largest front, maybe the third or fourth largest front in this war, have sent numerous ballistic missiles. We thought that maybe that front was neutralized at this point, but it's not. It's still an active front. The Houthis are still causing havoc in the Red Sea. It's still interrupting international shipping, still have significant missiles, and just a demonstration that this war is not over, even though we have seen the ceasefire declared between Israel and Hezbollah.
So with that ceasefire, the focus now is on the war in Gaza. Hostage negotiations resume over the weekend. Hamas delegation arrives in Cairo on Saturday for talks with Egyptian officials on a possible ceasefire. So what do we know at this point in terms of where this is heading?
Well, certainly the Biden administration is going to shift the focus now towards the Gaza Strip. We've heard Amos Hochstein, who helped negotiate the ceasefire with Hezbollah, state that the president also would now try to refocus efforts on a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, also hoping to get the hostages out. It's obviously the biggest component over here. And when the prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, talked about the ceasefire agreement with Hezbollah, one of the reasons that he specified was to isolate Hamas. And there was this whole idea that Hamas always thought that it could count on Hezbollah to back it and to fight. And now the ceasefire in Lebanon, which we'll talk about the ceasefire and many elements of it in a few minutes, that the ceasefire would now isolate Hamas, whereby they would know that they don't have Iran's backing, they don't have Hezbollah's backing. And the hope was that perhaps that the ceasefire in Lebanon could lead to some kind of a ceasefire agreement in the Gaza Strip and some kind of other negotiations to get the hostages back.
So Prime Minister Netanyahu this week saying he would agree to a pause in the fighting in order to bring the hostages home, come to some sort of deal with Hamas. But that being said, he will not accept an end to the war until the goals are met. In addition to securing the release of the hostages, making sure that Hamas is no longer a viable threat to the state of Israel.
And this is a little bit of a risky tactics by Netanyahu. You know, on the one hand saying, okay, I'll agree to some kind of a temporary pause in the fighting so we can get our hostages back, but we're going to keep going after that's over. So the question is, why on earth would Hamas give the hostages back if they've held them for so long, if they knew that after they gave the hostages back that the IDF would just continue fighting from where it left off? So on the one hand, it sounds good from the Israeli perspective, what Netanyahu is saying, but in realpolitik, whether or not Netanyahu could accomplish that, we're not sure. With the ceasefire in Lebanon, for example, in Israel, the idea is being floated that this is more of a temporary cessation of the hostilities. And President Biden said in his announcement after the ceasefire was presented that this is a permanent ceasefire. So, if you enter into some kind of an agreement here with the Gaza Strip, and if Hamas basically says, okay, we surrender, whatever that means, and they give back the hostages, just because Netanyahu said that he wants to go back and continue the fighting afterwards doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to have a green light, not from Biden and maybe not from President Trump, to go back in and restart fighting after some kind of negotiation.
Yeah, I had the opportunity to attend a press conference this week with Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican Senator Graham from South Carolina, and he was quoted also as stating that President Trump wants to have the war ended as soon as possible. That being said, President Trump also said he wants a complete Israeli victory. But according to this quote here from Lindsey Graham, Trump is more determined than ever to release the hostages and supports a ceasefire that includes a hostage deal. He wants to see it happening now. That's Senator Lindsey Graham. again, a different vision of what a ceasefire or an end to a war would look like than the Biden administration, which wants an immediate ceasefire no matter what. The president-elect Trump saying that he would like to see an Israeli victory, but he would like to see it happen as soon as possible, even before he comes into office.
Now, on the face of it, Lindsey Graham has been one of the most pro-Israel senators. He's come to Israel more than most any other senator. I think even since the wars began, he's been here, I guess, 2 or 3 times. I've met him here in Israel before the war began. He was a major proponent of the normalization agreements and continues to be a very significant component, advocate rather, for the Israeli Saudi normalization. He talks about that a lot. But at the same time, Lindsey Graham continues to talk about the two-state solution. He's a big pusher of the creation of a Palestinian state to end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So on the one hand, he comes and he supports Israel. He says he loves Israel. He comes a lot. He's pushing normalization with the Arab states, wants to see that conflict come to an end. But even now, he's continuing to talk about a two-state solution when the war is still raging. And the war was started by Palestinians attacking Israel. The idea that the Palestinians could get a state after what they did on October 7th. And since then, it proves exactly why you should not have another failed state in the Middle East. And we'll talk about failed states in the Middle East in a few minutes as well.
On October the 8th, the very day after the Hamas massacre, Lindsey Graham was quoted as saying the two-state solution is dead. But only a month or two later, he went back and saying he still supports a vision of a two-state solution. I asked him point blank, do you still believe in a two-state solution? He did not answer the question directly. He talked again about normalization. He didn't say that the so-called Palestinian society is the most radicalized society in the world that has to be reformed in order to lead towards normalization, but he would not say that that two-state solution is dead. It's still on his plate.
What is interesting and worth watching is that Graham said that Donald Trump wants to see a Gaza ceasefire before he enters into office. And it seems as though there is some kind of coordination, at least, between the incoming Trump administration, the outgoing Biden administration, and Israel. There has to be some communication taking place between these 3 major parties at this time. And while we had heard that the Trump administration wanted to see an end to the war before he came in, that wasn't necessarily verified that the president actually said that, but people are saying that in the incoming president's name. But we always thought that Trump, what he wanted was to see a swift end to the war with a complete Israeli victory. These ceasefire agreements seem to indicate that Trump is more interested in just having a return to order than necessarily into an Israeli victory, which might change the paradigm for decades to come, as opposed to just like altering the paradigm and maybe canonizing the current paradigm, whatever it is now, as the new state of affairs. Let's just get to an end of violence so that he can come into office and say that he stopped it.
At the same time, Hamas continues to be Hamas, maniacally using the hostages as their tool in the propaganda battle. Yesterday evening, Hamas releasing a video of 20-year-old Eden Alexander, if I'm not mistaken, a dual U.S.-Israeli citizen who's still being held by the terrorist organization. And from what I understand, the video was verified as being recorded recently. Eden Alexander is still in the dungeons, the hell of Hamas, being held in Gaza. Of course, showing the video, propaganda, everything that comes out of his mouth, sadly, is being scripted by Hamas. And on one hand, it's good to see that at least some hostages are still alive. I heard reports maybe 50, 60, please God, all 101.
Right.
But again, Hamas using...
Yeah, Israeli President Herzog had told President Trump that he said that there was Israeli intelligence that maybe as many as 50 of the hostages were alive. And President Trump is reported to have said that he didn't realize that there could be so many hostages still alive.
Right.
He was under the impression that most of the hostages at this point were dead. So certainly Israel has a lot to negotiate for. If Prime Minister Netanyahu can get the hostages back, I think that could alleviate a lot of the pain and suffering of the Israelis on the one hand. Number two, demonstrate that he was serious about getting the hostages back all along. And take away this psychological warfare card from Hamas and be able to fight the war on the basis of the security issues alone, and not have to fight the war on the basis of also recognizing that anything that they do could potentially harm the hostages.
At the same time, we've said many times that UNRWA is Hamas, the UNRWA organization, essentially the humanitarian branch of the Hamas terror organization down there. Many of their members actually participating in the October 7th massacre. Now we have a situation where the World Central Kitchen, those bringing aid supposedly to the people in Gaza, they are now pausing operations after Israel revealed one of its staff members who was killed in an airstrike. He himself actually took part in the October 7th massacre in kibbutz near Oz. So you'll have all of these Israel haters saying, oh, Israel massacred this humanitarian worker, whatnot. But now we have proof that this individual, his name here, Khazmi Kadi, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, from the World Central Kitchen, he is actually in cahoots with Hamas, taking part in the massacre on October the 7th.
And you remember several months back that there was an incident in which Israel actually fired on a convoy that turned out to be from the World Central Kitchen. Those cars were not marked at the time as being part of the World Central Kitchen, but World Central Kitchen saying that they were informing Israel where they would be. Israel saying that there were Hamas terrorists using that convoy for transportation. Whether or not these Hamas operatives are involved in taking some of the humanitarian aid, which we know is happening over and over and over again. So we don't know what role World Central Kitchen plays in taking humanitarian aid and delivering it straight to Hamas, or what role World Central Kitchen is allowing Hamas to play in determining who gets that aid. But it was one of those big incidents that happened during the war where they say, look, Israel's specifically targeting these humanitarian organizations. Israel's fighting a war in real time in the Gaza Strip, and unfortunately, Hamas terrorists have they've gotten themselves inside every single UN agency, every single humanitarian aid agency. They still remain a major force to be reckoned with inside Gaza. And that's the reason why Netanyahu says that even if we negotiate to get the hostages back, that the war has to continue, because the goals of the war between Israel and Hamas inside Gaza are A, obviously to get the hostages back, but B, to remove Hamas as a military threat to Israel, which they have mostly done, but C, to remove Hamas from political power in the Gaza Strip. And here we see through the World Central Kitchen and others that Hamas still plays a role as a strongman inside Gaza, and it's going to be difficult. It might take a long time for Israel to completely eliminate Hamas's control over the Gaza Strip.
The next story makes my blood boil, I'll be honest with you. Out of everything we're talking about today, this one really, really gets to me. You have former defense minister of the state of Israel, former chief of staff of the IDF, Moshe Ya'alon. He was on some sort of panel just the other day, and he said flat out that Israel is carrying out ethnic cleansing in the Gaza Strip.
וזה לא קשור לימין שמאל. בעד היפרדות ולא מדינה דו-לאומית, מדינת אפרטהייד. או ללכת בדרך שכרגע גוררים אותנו, לכבוש, לספח, לטהר טיהור אתני, תסתכלו על צפון הרצועה, טרנספר, תקראו לזה שאתם רוצים, ולהתיישב יישוב יהודי.
We have a war on the battlefield. We have a war of ideas. And here you have a former defense minister of the state of Israel lending credence to those who accuse Israel of all these horrible things that we're doing, supposedly apartheid, starvation, and in his words, ethnic cleansing. This just gets me riled up. It's unbelievable how this plays into the hands of the haters of the state of Israel on social media and the regular media or whatnot. I guarantee you over the next 24, 48 hours, you're going to have so many people quoting, well, the former defense minister of the state of Israel says Israel's carrying out ethnic cleansing. I mean, this was a guy who was supposed to be the future leader of the Likud party.
Exactly.
That didn't work out for him. And all of a sudden, he flip-flopped back to his roots, by the way, because he comes from the left, back to his roots. But in this case, I think it's just disgraceful for him to make these remarks while we're fighting a PR war, whether you like Prime Minister Netanyahu or not. To come out publicly and accuse Israel of something that's not happening, specifically ethnic cleansing, is despicable. And I think that he should be taken to task, held accountable for these comments.
Well, you mentioned it, that Bogi Ya'alon was really thought to be potentially the successor to Netanyahu. He was the defense minister several years back, and he was actually one of the first to defect from Netanyahu's government, causing this cycle of these 5 consecutive elections, because what happened was at the time that Netanyahu wanted to strengthen a coalition. He wanted to bring Avigdor Lieberman into the government. This is, I think, already back in something like 2015. I need to check it. But Netanyahu wanted to bring in Lieberman. Lieberman demanded to be the defense minister. Ya'alon was the defense minister. So Netanyahu turned around to Bogi Ya'alon and asked him to move and become the foreign minister instead of the defense minister, which would have given him, a different set of experience than he had. Of course, I mean, he was definitely more qualified to be the defense minister, but the way coalition politics works is that if you want to strengthen a coalition, a lot of times you have to give in to the demands of other coalition partners in order to balance everything. And instead of gracefully moving over to the foreign ministry, and he could have been very publicly disappointed with it, and he could have said as much. He should have said, I am definitely more qualified to be the defense minister. I want to continue to serve as the defense minister, but if the prime minister asks me to serve as the foreign minister, which is one of the highest ranking positions in the prime minister's cabinet, he should have just accepted that and moved right over. But he didn't. He resigned, and he was one of the first defectors that led to some other defectors too, and he is joined maybe one of the early members of this like BB derangement syndrome camp that we have inside Israel. And at this point, there's nothing that Netanyahu will do that Bogi Ya'alon will say is a good idea, even if Bogi Ya'alon himself was a proponent of that at some earlier time. And like we said, to accuse Israel of ethnic cleansing, doesn't he see what's going on in the United Nations? Doesn't he see what's going on in the International Criminal Court and in the International Court of Justice? But what he does see, when he looks at the International Criminal Court, is that he's not the defense minister, and the ICC is not issuing arrest warrants for Bogi Ya'alon. They see that the ICC wants to issue arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu, and this whole BB derangement syndrome camp, they just want him out, And the thing is that they understand that the electorate is not changing the prime minister. Netanyahu's been to election time and time and time again, and the people keep choosing Netanyahu as the prime minister over any of the other candidates. Should Netanyahu get out of the way? That's a conversation for another time. But meanwhile, he keeps going up against other candidates and he keeps winning. And if we go to another election today, there's a good chance that he would win again. So this whole BB derangement syndrome camp, they look at the electorate and they say the electorate's messing up. They're picking the wrong guy. So what we need to do is we need to get more international pressure on the electorate at home here, or figure out some other way to get Netanyahu out. So he's specific. He's intentionally feeding the beast here. Okay, and pushing the ICC and the international community to act upon arrest warrants for Netanyahu just because he wants Netanyahu out of power. But I think it's also important to look at what he's accusing Israel of, along with the ethnic cleansing. What did he say?
Occupation, attempting to annex Gaza, ethnic cleansing. And
I mean, he said here also, he said transfer call what you want in Jewish settlements, right? And I think it is important to note that there is a significant camp inside of Israel which wants to see Israel and the IDF maintain control over at least part of the land of the Gaza Strip. There's definitely a camp here that says that Israel should maintain control of the entirety of the Gaza Strip, but the more limited say, well, at least the northern Gaza Strip. And there are significant voices inside Israel which state that refugees should be allowed to leave the Gaza Strip if they so choose to.
Right. But ethnic cleansing means that you're deliberately targeting another people for mass extermination.
Meanwhile, Israel has not
completely false.
Israel has not forced a single Gazan out of the Strip. I mean, that could have been something they could have done on day one of this war.
That could have saved more lives, but UNRWA is holding them there as pawns.
That's a good point. That's a good point.
And they won't let them in Egypt. Egypt itself closed its borders.
So the accusations of ethnic cleansing and genocide, they don't add up. But to have a former defense minister and chief of staff of the military saying it, I mean, it's terrible. And this is part of the old school concepcia here in Israel, much of which is controlled by the left. Bogi Ya'alon is now taking his position with the Israeli left and just accusing Israel of the worst things, specifically because it's Netanyahu at the helm.
Despicable politics, and it looks like he'll probably try to make. I wouldn't be surprised trying to make a return to politics with maybe Yair Lapid or one of the left so-called senators.
But every time they do this, it doesn't work.
Always X-fires on them.
They can get a slot because the way the parliamentary system works is that a party can pull a guy in and put him on the list, but that party will get the same amount of seats as it would have gotten without him, and then. Sure enough, those parties don't necessarily score so well. Maybe you'll be a minister, maybe you won't, but he's an irrelevant voice at this point in Israeli politics, and sometimes the most irrelevant voices. And you see like Ehud Olmert, the former prime minister,
and Ehud Barak, prime minister also.
They're irrelevant to the electorate, but they cause a lot of trouble behind the scenes.
Yeah, they pen these op-eds in the New York Times or whatnot. They get the attention of the world and the social media and the international community. It just hurts Israel. Let's move back to Hamas here. Unfortunately, on Friday, a terrorist attack carried out near Ariel, a shooting targeting a school bus of civilians traveling between Ariel in Samaria and Tel Aviv. 9 Israelis wounded, 3 in serious condition. 1, from what I understand, on Friday afternoon, somebody was fighting for their lives. Again, the terrorist from Hamas. So here you have Hamas supposedly in good faith negotiating a ceasefire from Gaza, which is absolutely baloney. It just shows you who they really are. Let's remember, Hamas carried out so many suicide bombings back in the 90s and in the early 2000s. So let's not make any mistake who they are. All of a sudden, no, they want to negotiate. They've softened their positions on the ceasefire, yet one of their members carrying out this mass shooting, leaving 9 Israelis wounded near Ariel.
Well, first of all, I have a daughter in university at Ariel, and she was on a bus to Ariel as this was happening. So,
nerve-wracking.
Yeah, it's nerve-wracking, and this is terrorism, and terrorism continues inside Israel. It hasn't really blown up to the point where Israel's had no choice but to launch a major operation in Judea and Samaria like they did when Ariel Sharon was the prime minister as of yet. But there have been a lot of limited operations inside Judea and specifically in Samaria where Ariel is located in order to root out these terror cells. The strategy of what they call mowing the grass in Judea and Samaria to make it so that the situation there doesn't sprout into what happened in the Gaza Strip. When you talk about Hamas softening their positions, I mean, the only reason why Hamas would be ready to negotiate a ceasefire is because they're afraid of the IDF, because they want to use negotiations as a tool of survival, right? If they thought that they were defeating Israel, they would never negotiate. It's only when they recognize that their own existence is imperiled that they say, okay, we'll negotiate. And that's the reason why they took hostages to begin with, because they knew that they would be annihilated by the IDF, and the hostages, the only psychological warfare weapon that they possess. That's their ace card. So when they see that Israel's continued to press ahead, and that even there's a ceasefire with Hezbollah, and they're left out to die, to be annihilated, that's when you see that they say, okay, we're ready to negotiate.
Yeah, and it reports this morning an airstrike, by the way, Israel Air Force targeting a terror cell in Jenin. I still haven't gotten all the details on that, but as you mentioned, mowing the ground, Israel continuing to fight the battle, which has gone on for years and years in Judea and Samaria. Let's get now to the ceasefire with Hezbollah, which happened earlier in the week. This probably would have been top story if it happened a day or two ago. But Israel and the Hezbollah terrorist organization from November 27th are at a ceasefire. Some are saying this is the end of the war. Prime Minister Netanyahu making clear that this is not the end of the war, just a potential 60-day ceasefire, or at least 60 days it'll take until the IDF pulls back. Obviously waiting. It's no coincidence until the Trump administration takes over. You have the Hezbollah terrorist organization supposed to retreat north about 18 miles or so north of the Litani River. Both sides supposed to keep things quiet. The Lebanese army is supposed to swoop in. Where were they all this time in order to fill that void? You still have UNIFIL up there. And there have still been, and we'll get to that in a minute or two, Israeli airstrikes when necessary. You have terrorist groups affiliated with Hezbollah approaching the border with Israel. You also have strikes in the area of the Syrian-Lebanon border. We'll get to that as well. But at the end of the day, the ceasefire is supposed to be in line with UN Security Council Resolution 1701 from the 2006 Second Lebanon War, which was never fulfilled. You never had Hezbollah dismantling. That was ignored for years and years and years, and that's actually what basically caused the start of the hostilities now with Hezbollah. But United States, France, Israel working together to maintain some sort of calm. Let's see how long it lasts. But a lot of things to break down here with the ceasefire.
Well, as you know, and we were saying on the show, I did not think that Israel was going to enter into a ceasefire agreement. I thought that they were, entertaining the idea of a ceasefire in order to appease the Biden administration as the clock ticked down to the turning over of the beginning of the Trump administration. And you did mention this 60-day drawdown period where the IDF will maintain its positions and gradually reduce them to leave southern Lebanon within 60 days. And yes, you are correct that at the end of that period, there will be a new president in the United States. So basically the IDF is saying that they will remain in this buffer zone of about 5 kilometers north of the Israeli border for 60 days to make sure that this ceasefire gets implemented. There has been already, we see a return of Hezbollah moving down towards the border from the very moment that the ceasefire was created. The difference between 1701, perhaps, which was a completely failed resolution that UNIFIL, these UN peacekeeping forces, were supposed to guarantee and never did. Difference here is that the Lebanese army is supposed to also play a role. But who is the Lebanese army?
Seriously,
right? Is it not possible for Hezbollah to infiltrate the Lebanese army? Right? They have already been proven to have infiltrated the Lebanese army on many occasions.
The Lebanese government.
Exactly. Well, they're members of the parliament in the Lebanese government. So to an extent, they play a role in controlling the Lebanese army, and they can just put their own Hezbollah terrorists in Lebanese army uniforms, and they can be the Lebanese army. So it's like the fox guarding the henhouse to an extent over here. But the IDF does remain in the United States, and France are supposed to serve as sort of guarantors of this agreement. Why that becomes interesting is because after the 60-day period, if there's violations, if the United States is a guarantor and there's a new U.S. president, they may turn around and say, look, Hezbollah is violating this agreement, and now we're going to give a green light to Israel to keep going. But if things do get quiet, and we didn't get any rocket warnings over Shabbat this week. Hezbollah is not firing on Israel the way they were very heavily in the weeks leading up to the war. And I think that the questions you have to ask is, why did Israel do it? If we didn't think that Israel was going to do it, what happened? What led them to want to do this?
Yeah, this is a good chance to listen to Prime Minister Netanyahu explaining exactly in his reasoning why Israel agreed to a ceasefire with Hezbollah. Let's go to the video.
אז למה לעשות הפסקת אש עכשיו? יש 3 סיבות עיקריות. סיבה ראשונה, התמקדות באיום האיראני. ולא ארחיב על כך. סיבה שנייה, רענון כוחות וחידוש מלאים. ואני אומר לכם בגלוי, כי זה לא סוד. היו עיכובים גדולים בהספקת נשק וחימושים. והעיכוב הזה עומד להשתחרר בקרוב. נצטייד באמצעי לחימה מתקדמים שישמרו על חיי חיילינו ויתנו לנו כוח מחץ נוסף להשלים את משימותינו. וסיבה שלישית להפסקת אש. ניתוק הזירה ובידוד החמאס. מהיום השני של המלחמה, החמאס בנה על חיזבאללה שילחם לצידו. וכשחיזבאללה מחוץ לתמונה, החמאס נותר לבד במערכה. הלחץ שלנו עליו יגבר, וזה יסייע למשימה הקדושה של שחרור חטופינו.
So again, from Prime Minister Netanyahu, the three main reasons. Number one, so Israel can focus exclusively, or rather directly, I should say, on Iran, on the Iranian threat, specifically the Iranian nuclear threat. Number two, to give the IDF an opportunity to replenish its forces, to give the soldiers a break. And because Israel is lacking the ammunition as a result of the Biden administration withholding key arms, which we need in the war against Hezbollah and on other terror fronts. So that's a big point. And the third one is to put pressure on Hamas to come to some sort of deal. And again, Hamas, in theory, already, the second the Hezbollah deal was announced, reportedly softening their positions. Again, Hamas is not, Hamas has said that they didn't until now agreed to any sort of ceasefire. But those are the three main reasons that Israel, at least publicly, and then, of course, you have the UN Security Council and the threat Israel faces from the United States if, in fact, they would abstain or vote for an immediate end to a ceasefire, which would leave Hamas in power. That is something the Prime Minister does not want to see, hence the 60-day period until the Trump administration takes over.
I think there's a lot to unravel here. First of all, I think that the idea of isolating Hamas, this is a bit of a spin. I always thought that it was better that the war expanded from the original front of just Israel versus Hamas and Gaza, because when you just had this singular front, then it was viewed by the international community as just part of this intractable Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Israel attacking Palestinians, Palestinians attacking Israel. Once Hezbollah and the Houthis got involved, then Iran got involved directly, you saw that this had really very little to do with the Palestinian people themselves, as can be witnessed from the fact that the Palestinians in Judea and Samaria, aside from these isolated terror attacks, they're not in full-on attack mode against the state of Israel, right? So this isn't a war against the Palestinian people per se. It's a war against Iran and all of its proxies, of which Hamas is one of them. I think that the other reasons are more important here. And we keep hearing more and more about how the Israeli weapons supply is depleted. Now, that could be true. I think that that's a very, very poor message to be putting out there. It justifies Hamas and Hezbollah's positions that dragging out this war and creating a war of attrition could ultimately make the state of Israel extremely vulnerable and just empty out its weapons stores. And so even if that is the case, I don't know why Israel would be openly acknowledging that that's true. And the amount of time that Israel would have had to wait until the Trump administration comes in is 60 days. So the idea that Israel's putting out there that it couldn't even wait 60 days, and I think about this like a football game, Josh, so you were always waiting for me to do a sports analogy.
Always.
But, like in the beginning of the war, Hezbollah jumps in and they're striking the Israeli communities in the north. And, in the first quarter, they kick a few field goals and Israel's caught by surprise. Maybe Israel kicks a field goal. They're losing like 9-3 at the end of the first quarter. Second quarter, the IDF comes out and they score a few touchdowns, right? They assassinate Nasrallah. They have the beepers. They have the pagers go off, the walkie-talkies, major touchdowns. They kick a field goal. They got Fuad Shukr, the number 2 of Hezbollah also. But Hezbollah still, they're shooting also, and they kick a couple field goals in the quarters, a lot of action. Third quarter now, beginning of the third quarter, Hezbollah is scoring touchdowns. Like they had a drone, it hit Netanyahu's house. They hit a kindergarten in Haifa. They killed 2 people in a rocket attack in Nahariya.
Synagogue in
Haifa also. They're kicking field goals also, and Israel. And now all of a sudden it's getting to the winter. It's starting to rain. Everybody's tired. It's a slop fest. And it's just one of those times in the game where, you just needed Israel to have one of those drives that starts back on their own 10-yard line and takes like 8 or 9 minutes off the clock. One of those like 14, 15 play drives that just eats the clock away, because in the fourth quarter, Trump's going to be the president and that you're going to have the opportunity to win this game, and you're at home. And instead of like eating out that clock, like they just punted, and from deep in their own territory, they just punted and they gave up their field position. They told the whole world that they don't have the weapons. So I think that's that's very weak. It's just very weak posturing, even if it's true. I do think that the UN resolutions play into it. I think that Netanyahu was shaken up hard by the arrest warrants, and you saw that by having France be one of these guarantors, the very day after the ceasefire was declared, France saying, well, there is immunity for countries that don't participate in the ICC, and Israel's one of those countries, so maybe there's some immunity from the arrest warrants, indications that they might not follow up on the arrest warrants if Netanyahu was to come to France. So I know that Netanyahu is concerned about this, and he's worried about the UN Security Council resolution. Now, I actually have a different position regarding the UN Security Council resolution. And if there was a Security Council resolution, it was going to be bad this time. Not like the one that Obama passed in 2016, which said that Israel should stop building settlements. It was bad words, but ultimately it had very little impact on what happened here. But the rumors were, the reports were that a UN Security Council resolution on Israel at this time could call Israel a threat to global peace. And could call for global weapons bans against Israel.
Basically, what you're saying is the sanctioning that they've been doing against residents of Judea and Samaria, they would then open them to Israel, right, as a whole.
And other governments could have invoked sanctions against Israel, and it would have been very bad. At the same time, you have to understand that the UN and its institutions, including the ICC and the International Court of Justice, these are the eighth front in the seven front war, okay? They are not friends. They are total adversaries and enemies of the Jewish people. And the Trump administration is coming in. The Trump administration, had even in its first administration, talked about the United Nations, and they pulled out a lot of money from UNESCO, from UNRWA, from all these UN agencies. Now, if the UN would have passed a horrific resolution against Israel in the final days right before Trump becomes the president, I think there would be a very good chance that Trump would take severe punitive action against the United Nations, which is what is required. Okay, the UN is a completely corrupt and unjust anti-Semitic body, and it needs to be completely reformed, if not completely eliminated. And I think that if they would have passed the resolution, you might have had a better chance to do that. If the UN says, okay, well, they called the ceasefire, I guess, we'll just wait it out. We won't pass the resolution against Israel in this little transition period. Maybe Trump doesn't have the ammunition that he needs to take severe actions against the UN. So, I understand why you don't want to see the resolution. On the other hand, I think that there could be some benefits even in the long term, even if such a resolution gets passed.
So let's go back to your football analogy. It's the fourth quarter and we just punted. If that's the case, what does the end of the game look like? What is the final score? And, do we win it in the fourth quarter? Do we need overtime if we're sticking to that analogy? I mean, what does it look like at this point?
Right. Netanyahu talked about total victory. And in Gaza, he's made it very clear what the total victory looks like. We said it earlier. You get the hostages back. Hamas is no longer a military force. Hamas is no longer a political force in Gaza. And he hasn't really defined what total victory looks like in Lebanon. Now, it's been incredible what the IDF has been able to accomplish.
I want to interrupt you here and just read the stats here while we're on that. Israel struck more than 12,500 Hezbollah terrorist sites since October the 8th. Terrorist assets destroyed, including 1,600 command and control centers, 1,000 weapons storage facilities. We've killed between 2,500 and 3,500 Hezbollah terrorists. 11 brigade level commanders, 37 battalion commanders, 46 company commanders. Those are some of the stats in terms of what we've accomplished.
And we took out the top leadership. We took out Nasrallah and several of the other top leaders. And it was always assessed that Hezbollah could open up and start firing on Israel long-range rockets, precision-guided rockets that could take out significant infrastructure that could have killed tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Israelis, that they would be able to fire rockets at a clip of thousands per day. And that if that happened, that the IDF, would be at a significant disadvantage. And it actually would represent something of an existential threat. So the IDF they neutralized that threat. They after the assassination of Fuad Shukr, they were getting ready for a big attack. Israel swooped in the very moments before that 5 a.m. scheduled attack. They took out tons, so many of the launchers that Hezbollah had, which they needed to fire those weapons. Israel's taken out many thousands of long-range rockets. And they also neutralized the threat of a Radwan force border crossing, similar to an October 7th crossing. So, Netanyahu, by his own estimate, has degraded Hezbollah's capabilities by 70 to 80%. But is 70 to 80% total victory, right? Maybe it would have been better for Israel to go the distance and remove 90 to 95% of that capability. And also, as we mentioned, Hezbollah continues to be a political presence inside Lebanon. And I think that Israel should also be demanding that Hezbollah no longer be a member of this Lebanese parliament. Perhaps that's something that they'll be able to do when Trump is in office. Trump can issue the demand that Hezbollah Lebanon expel Hezbollah from their parliament, be willing to put harsh sanctions on Lebanon if they don't expel Hezbollah from the parliament. So, it looks like what Netanyahu has done, if the ceasefire represents the end of fighting, they've altered the paradigm, with Hezbollah, but they haven't completely flipped the paradigm. And there's very little doubt that Hezbollah will try, however they need to rebuild their capabilities. And maybe that will be with Iran if Iran's not taken out. If Iran is taken out and they're no longer able to be a backer, Hezbollah might look for other backers, maybe Turkey, for example. That's something we can talk about in a minute.
Even with the ceasefire on Thursday, Israel Air Force attacks a Hezbollah rocket facility in Lebanon after detecting terrorist activity in violation of the truce. Also, Israeli fighter jets Saturday attacking a terrorist infrastructure position along the Syria-Lebanon border. Hezbollah was actively using to smuggle weapons into Lebanon from Syria. So now, there you have it.
Now, maybe part of Netanyahu's bet is that Hezbollah will violate the ceasefire, right? And then he's kind of like
they already did.
He's kind of like bought a period of 60 days where now weapons are being replenished. The Biden administration already announcing that they were going to allow some weapons through. And some of this is munitions. Some of it is heavy bombs, like those 2,000-pound bombs that is the only shipment that the United States has openly stated is not allowing through, even though you have Republican senators saying it's much more than that. But we're also talking about these like D9 bulldozers, many of which Israel, has sustained the damage to and needs to be replenished. We're talking about also Apache helicopters, some of which have been damaged or just because of the amount of usage that they've had, they need servicing and they haven't had time to do that. So maybe Israel does get some of these weapons back, then they get a new president in town, and maybe the fighting does ultimately resume.
One last story here before we have to go. And this is very, very complicated. It appears to be that the civil war in Syria has relaunched here. You have Syrian Islamists taking control over the city of Aleppo. This is the first time in 8 years amid apparent collapse of government defenses in the area. At the same time, you have Kurdish groups who are fighting against those rebels. It seems like you have Turkey involved, you have Iran involved, Russia. It seems like the Syrian civil war has been reignited over the last several days. You have hundreds killed. By the way, it should be noted that the focus of the international community is not on Syria, even though you've had hundreds of people killed already. It still is on Gaza. It still is on Hezbollah. It still is on Israel. No Jews, no news. But this is going on right now in Syria. I don't see the UN going crazy about that situation.
Well, it's not so much about an issue of the UN, and we know about the UN, but here, and it is very complicated. But you have Syria is just one of the many failed states in the Middle East. Iraq is a failed state, Syria is a failed state, Lebanon is a failed state, Yemen is a failed state, Gaza is a failed state. And when you have states that are failed states, what happens is that other players come in and they try to take over and gain influence. And what you're seeing right here is a major tug of war now between Iran and Turkey. Iran has been significantly degraded. Okay, their forward-facing army was Hezbollah. Hezbollah has been significantly degraded. Iran's air defenses have been completely eliminated. They're very vulnerable. They're out of money, and that they can't commit troops anymore to maintain the presence in Syria as they were able to before. Israel's been striking at Iranian positions in Syria with regularity since October 7th, and that's creating a vulnerability in a vacuum. And Turkey has been trying also to reassert itself as the home of the caliphate, right? The new force that wants to try to extend its regional hegemony.
The Hamas leaders have moved there from Qatar.
Exactly. It's an important component here also. Where Russia comes into play in all this, Russia's been a force that also entered into Syria during that civil war, and is an important player in that area as well. So basically what you're seeing is that the failure, number one, of U.S. policy to back Iran, because Iran was able to destabilize those areas. And you see how it's playing itself out now across the entire Middle East. But this is a region that's going to have to be navigated very carefully, not just by Israel, but also by the United States. Are they just going to let these forces all, fight against each other and hope that everybody wins? Or are they going to be able to restore order, by working with the players that they think are the forces of moderation? Israel should be one of those forces. I think the Trump administration will work closely with Israel, and I hope that they will both continue to isolate Iran, and hopefully even overthrow that regime, but also to isolate Turkey and not allow it to grab a foothold in other parts of the region and expand its regional influence.
As bad as the Syrian regime is, people need to know that one of these, or some of these, anti-Syrian regime groups are actually offshoots of Al-Qaeda. So you can't make it look like these are the good guys coming in, swooping in and taking over Syria and wanting to maintain, some sort of calm in that area. They would turn on us in a heartbeat. These are anti-Israel groups as well. I don't know so much about the Kurdish groups. I mean, usually Israel tends to side with a lot of these Kurdish groups.
The Kurdish groups tend to be the least violent of the groups, and they only strike when attacked. And
HTS, they're an Al-Qaeda offshoot. They're waving the Islamic flags there in Aleppo, so they're no friend of Israel. So you have to pay attention to.
It should also be noted that there is also instability taking place inside Egypt, and Egypt is also looking to sort of reposition itself against what it views as what could be the other power players in the region. So, the entire region now is being shaken up by what Israel is doing with Iran, by Iran's position. And it's a dangerous time in the Middle East.
Absolutely. Just to mention here, Britain, France, and Germany agreeing to continue negotiations on Iran's nuclear program, following a meeting this past Friday in Geneva. Again, I guess trying to maximize the final days of the Biden administration, because they know it's a whole new ball game there when Trump takes over. And this is a story we're going to have to pay attention to in the weeks ahead as Iran strives for nuclear weapons. And hopefully Israel, together with the new Trump administration, will come together in a joint unified force and go after Iran. But that's all the time we have for today. No doubt this will be in the headlines in the weeks and months ahead. You've been listening to and watching Jerusalem Minute here on JNS TV. Josh Haston, along with CEO of JNS, Alex Trayman, here in Jerusalem. Shout out to Ryan Lifshitz, Avia Asner, and Zach Sickerman, all the people behind the scenes here at JNS TV. Log on to all the amazing content provided by JNS TV, as well as jns.org for all the latest news and views out of Israel, the Middle East, and the Jewish world. Continue to pray for the well-being of the brave men and women of the IDF protecting us here 24/7. Have a great week, everybody. See you next week on Jerusalem Minute.